They say desire is a fire that burns clean, that passion between bodies is natural and human, that what happens in darkness stays in darkness. And perhaps for men this is true. Perhaps they can touch and take and walk away unburdened. But for women, desire is evidence, passion is crime. And what happens in darkness becomes accusation in daylight. And I learned this when I was 19. Learned it in the span of 12 hours that transformed me from desired to condemned to erased. Learned it in the journey from his bed to the magistrate's court to the cell where I waited to die. And the worst part was not the accusation or the trial or even the knowledge that I would hang. The worst part was understanding that he had forgotten me before the rope ever touched my neck, had dismissed me from his mind the moment I became inconvenient, had loved me and destroyed me and moved forward without pause. And I was simply gone, simply removed, simply a problem solved. And this erasure was more complete than death, was being unmade, was having every moment we shared rewritten as if I had never existed except as threat, as corruption, as something that needed to be eliminated. And I carried this knowledge to the scaffold and beyond, carried it through the resurrection that should have been impossible, carried it through decades of surviving what should have killed me, and I carry it still. The understanding that to some people you are only real while you are useful, only visible while you are wanted, only human while you serve their needs. And the moment you become complicated or demanding or simply inconvenient, you disappear, not gradually but instantly, not with regret but with relief. And perhaps this is the truest death. Not the body's ending, but the erasure from someone's memory while you still draw breath. The understanding that you mattered so little, that forgetting you required no effort at all. My name is Verity Ashford, and I was born in Salem in 1673 to a family that was prosperous enough to be comfortable, but not prominent enough to be powerful. My father was a physician. My mother came from a merchant family. And I was their only child, was raised with education and expectations, was taught to read and write and think, was prepared to be the wife of someone appropriate, someone from a good family who would value intelligence alongside beauty. And I believed this future was certain, believed I would marry well and live comfortably and perhaps even be happy. And I was content with this belief until I met Marcus Hale. Until I learned that some futures are not destinations but traps. That desire can be the mechanism of your own destruction. That wanting someone who wants you back is not safety, but the most dangerous position you can occupy. Marcus was the youngest son of Magistrate William Hale, was 26 when I met him, was handsome in the way that made women notice and mothers approve, was educated at Harvard, was being groomed for a position in the colonial government, was everything my parents would have chosen for me if they had been given the choice. And he noticed me at a gathering, noticed me and decided he wanted me. And he pursued me with an intensity that felt like love, with attention that felt like devotion, with promises that felt like forever. And I responded because how could I not? Because he was everything I had been taught to value, everything I had been raised to want. And when he kissed me for the first time in the garden behind his father's house, I felt like the luckiest woman in Salem, felt chosen in a way that made me giddy, felt that my life was beginning properly, was moving toward the future I had always imagined. He courted me properly for 3 months. Courted me with flowers and poetry and walks through Salem where everyone could see. Courted me with his father's approval and my parents' delight. Courted me with the understanding that we were building toward marriage, toward a formal engagement that would be announced before winter. And I believed this was real, believed we were moving together toward a shared future, believed that when he looked at me, he saw his wife, saw the mother of his children, saw his future as clearly as I saw mine. And perhaps he did. Perhaps in those 3 months he genuinely intended everything he implied. Or perhaps I was simply convenient, simply appropriate, simply the choice that made sense until a better option appeared. And I will never know which is true. Will never know if he meant any of it or if I was always just a placeholder. Always just the suitable choice he would make if nothing better materialized. The shift happened in the 4th month, happened subtly at first. His visits became later. His conversation became more intense. His touches became more insistent. And he began to speak about how difficult it was to wait. How much he wanted me. How the months until we could properly be together felt interminable. And he suggested that perhaps we did not need to wait. Perhaps anticipating our vows was not wrong when marriage was certain. Perhaps proving our love physically would only strengthen our bond. And I hesitated because I had been taught that anticipation was sin. That unmarried bodies joining was corruption. That waiting was the proof of virtue. But he was persuasive. Said that rules made by old men should not govern what existed between us. Said that our love was more sacred than arbitrary timing. Said that he needed me in ways that could not wait for formal ceremonies. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because he spoke with such certainty. Because surely a man of his station would not risk scandal unless he was completely committed. Unless marriage was absolute certainty. And I gave him what he asked for. Gave him myself in the darkness of his room when his family was sleeping. Gave him everything I had been taught to save. Because he convinced me that saving was unnecessary when the future was already decided. And afterward he held me and whispered promises. And I felt that we had crossed a threshold. That we were now bound in ways that transcended formality. That what we had done made us essentially married, even if the ceremony had not yet occurred. We continued like this for 2 months. Continued meeting in darkness. Continued joining our bodies while planning our future. And I noticed nothing wrong, noticed no change in his affection or attention. Noticed no diminishment in his promises. And perhaps that is why what happened felt so completely incomprehensible. Felt like the world inverting. Felt like discovering that everything you believed was a carefully constructed lie. Because there was no warning, no gradual cooling, no signs that might have prepared me for what was coming. There was only his desire one night and his accusation the next morning. Only his hands on my body in darkness and his finger pointing at me in daylight. Only his whispered words of love and his public testimony of corruption. And the speed of this transformation, the completeness of this reversal, was what destroyed me more than the accusations themselves. Was understanding that I had never known him at all, had loved a performance, had given myself to someone who could become my executioner without transition, without hesitation, without even the decency of visible conflict. I woke in my own bed the morning after we had been together. Woke feeling content and loved and secure in our shared future. And I prepared myself for the day thinking perhaps I would see him. Perhaps we would find a moment to exchange glances that held the secret of what we shared. And I went with my mother to the market. And I saw a crowd gathered near the meeting house. And I heard shouting. And my mother pulled me forward because she was curious. And I saw Marcus standing on the meeting house steps with his father beside him. And Marcus was speaking, was addressing the crowd, and his face was pale and his voice was shaking. And he was saying that he had something to confess, something that weighed on his conscience, something he could no longer keep silent about. And I felt cold spread through my body because I knew before he said my name. I knew he was about to destroy me, and he pointed. pointed directly at me standing in the crowd with my mother. And he said that Verity Ashford had bewitched him, had used unnatural means to cloud his judgment, had seduced him through demonic power, had made him do things he would never have done of his own free will. And his father stood beside him with his hand on his shoulder, looking both stern and sympathetic. And the crowd turned to look at me, and I saw in their faces not doubt or question, but immediate acceptance, immediate belief. Because why would Marcus Hale lie? Why would the magistrate's son destroy his own reputation unless forced by truth? And I tried to speak, tried to say it was not true, tried to explain that he had pursued me, that everything we had done had been willing, that I had used no magic because I had no magic to use. But my voice was drowned out by the shouting, by the accusations that began immediately, by people remembering that I had always been strange, always been too educated, always been too confident. And these qualities that had been acceptable when I was simply the physician's daughter became proof of corruption when I was accused, became evidence that I had always been witch, had always been dangerous, and I was seized, was dragged from my mother's side while she screamed, was taken directly to the prison without trial or hearing or any pretense of justice. And I looked back as they pulled me away, and I saw Marcus. Saw him watching with an expression I could not read. Something that might have been guilt or relief or simple emptiness. And then I was in the prison, and he was gone, and my life as I had known it was over. The cell was cold and dark and crowded with other accused women. And I sat in the corner and I tried to understand what had happened. Tried to find the moment when everything changed. Tried to identify the warning I had missed. And I could find nothing, could trace no path from his desire to his accusation, could see no logic in his transformation from lover to destroyer. And one of the other women, an old woman named Goody Martin, who had been imprisoned for 3 months, said to me in a voice rough with experience that I should not waste time seeking logic in men's betrayals. That men did not betray women because women deserved it or because circumstances forced it, but simply because betrayal was convenient, was the easiest solution to complicated situations. And she said that Marcus likely had his reasons, likely had pressures or promises or opportunities that required him to be unburdened by our connection. And making me the villain was cleaner than being honest. Was simpler than explaining that he had changed his mind. And she said I would probably never know the real reason, would never understand what motivated his accusation. And I should accept that not knowing was part of the punishment, was part of what made betrayal so devastating, the absence of explanation, the erasure of your importance even in your own destruction. My parents tried to see me but were turned away, were told that families of the accused could not visit, could not influence, could not interfere with God's justice. And I learned later that my father had gone to Magistrate Hale, had begged him to reconsider, had said there must be some mistake, and the magistrate had said that his son's testimony was clear, was credible, was corroborated by Marcus's obvious distress, and my father should consider carefully before defending a daughter who had clearly strayed from God's path. And my father had left that meeting understanding that defending me would destroy our family, would make them suspect by association, and he had chosen silence, had chosen to save himself and my mother rather than fight for me. And I understood this choice even as it hurt. Understood that love has limits, that parents will sacrifice children to survive, that I was already gone in their eyes, was already lost, and speaking for me would only drag them down too. And perhaps this was the most complete form of abandonment. Not active betrayal, but simply the withdrawal of defense. The decision to let me fall, because catching me would mean falling too. The trial was held a week after the accusation, was a formality rather than an inquiry, was theater designed to validate a conclusion already reached. And Marcus testified first, testified with tears running down his face, with visible distress that looked like anguish but that I now recognized as performance. And he told them how I had pursued him, how I had used beauty and intelligence to lure him, how I had gradually ensnared him until he could not resist, how he had found himself doing things that horrified him afterward, things he could not explain except as corruption, as outside influence, as demonic power clouding his natural judgment. And he said that he had finally broken free of my influence, had prayed and fasted and sought his Father's counsel, and God had given him strength to speak truth, to name what had been done to him, to save himself and warn others. And he spoke with such conviction, with such apparent sincerity, that even I almost believed him, almost wondered if perhaps I had somehow corrupted him without knowing it, without intending it, and this was his gift, his real talent, the ability to lie with such completeness that truth itself began to seem uncertain, began to seem like maybe he was right and I was the one misremembering. And I understood that this was not just betrayal but gaslighting, was not just accusation but reality manipulation, was him rewriting our entire history and doing it so effectively that even I could not hold firm against the revision. They asked me to respond, asked if I had practiced witchcraft, if I had used dark arts to seduce Marcus Hale, if I had signed the devil's book, and I said no, said none of it was true, said that Marcus had courted me willingly, that he had pursued me and promised me marriage, that everything we had done together had been consensual, had been his idea as much as mine. And they looked at me with pity and disgust. Pity because they believed I was so corrupted I could not see my own evil. Disgust because I was trying to drag down a respectable man rather than confess my sins. And the magistrate, Marcus's father, said that this was typical of witches, that they always tried to corrupt reputations, always tried to claim innocence while spreading lies, and my denials only proved my guilt, only showed how deeply the devil had his claws in me. And I understood that there was no defense I could offer, no truth I could speak that would be accepted, no way to save myself, because the trial was not about discovering truth, but about confirming what had already been decided. And I had been decided guilty before I ever entered the room, had been condemned the moment Marcus pointed at me. And everything that followed was simply the machinery of injustice grinding through its required motions. They found me guilty in less than an hour, found me guilty of witchcraft and conspiracy with Satan and attempted corruption of a Christian man, and they sentenced me to hang in 3 days. And I was taken back to my cell to wait for execution, and I sat in the darkness and I thought about Marcus, about the way he had held me, about the promises he had made, about how thoroughly he had convinced me that we had a future. And I tried to understand how someone could be so intimate with another person, could know their body and their thoughts and their fears, and then destroy them completely without apparent difficulty. And I concluded that intimacy was not knowledge, that physical closeness was not emotional connection, that I had believed we were building something together when he was simply taking what he wanted. And the moment I became inconvenient, the moment continuing our relationship required more than he was willing to give, he simply removed me, simply rewrote the narrative, simply made me the problem that needed solving, and he had solved me with brutal efficiency, had transformed love into accusation, had turned his own actions into my crimes, had made his desire my witchcraft, and he had done it without hesitation, without visible conflict, without anything that suggested he remembered me as human rather than obstacle. The night before my execution, I could not sleep, could not find any peace, could only sit in the darkness thinking about how I would die tomorrow for the crime of being desired, for the sin of being wanted and then being inconvenient. And I thought about Marcus in his comfortable bed in his father's house, and I wondered if he was sleeping peacefully, if he felt relief that the problem was solved, if he ever thought about me except as the situation he had successfully navigated. And I decided that he probably did sleep peacefully, probably felt he had done the right thing, probably had already rewritten his memories so thoroughly that he genuinely believed his own lies, believed I had corrupted him rather than that he had used me. And this capacity for self-deception, this ability to transform guilt into righteousness, was perhaps the most frightening thing about him, more frightening than the accusation or the betrayal, because it meant he was not struggling with conscience, was not tormented by what he had done, was simply comfortable, was simply fine, was simply living his life while I prepared to die for being the object of his desire. They came for me at dawn, came to take me to the scaffold, and I walked through Salem with my head up, walked past people who spat at me and cursed me, walked past my parents who stood at the edge of the crowd looking destroyed but silent, walked past Marcus who stood near the front with his father. And I stopped walking and looked directly at him, and I said loudly enough that everyone could hear that he knew the truth, that God knew the truth, that he would carry what he had done for the rest of his life, whether he acknowledged it or not. And the guards pulled me forward before I could say more. But I saw his face, saw something flicker in his expression. Something that might have been guilt or fear or simply irritation that I would not go quietly, would not let him forget me peacefully. And I took satisfaction in that small crack in his composure. Took comfort in knowing I had disrupted his narrative even briefly, even inadequately. I stood on the scaffold and the minister spoke about sin and corruption and the price of wickedness. And I looked out at the crowd and I saw Marcus. And I saw too that he was standing beside a young woman I recognized as Charity Green, daughter of a shipping merchant. A woman more prominent than I had been, more connected, more valuable. And I understood in that moment what had motivated everything. Understood that Marcus had found a better option, had been offered a marriage that advanced his position more than mine could, and I had simply become inconvenient, had become evidence of his prior commitment that needed to be eliminated, and destroying me had been the cleanest solution, the most efficient removal. And he had done it without remorse because I had never been important to him, had only been adequate until something better arrived. And this knowledge was somehow worse than thinking he had betrayed me from cruelty or fear. Was understanding that I had been discarded not even from active malice, but from simple calculation. From the understanding that I was no longer useful, and useful had been all I ever was to him. The noose went around my neck, and I felt the rough fiber against my skin. And I thought about desire. About how his desire for me had felt like love. About how being wanted had felt like being valued. About how I had confused his need for my body with caring about my person. And I understood that desire is not love. That being wanted is not the same as being respected. That physical intimacy creates no obligation, establishes no bond, means nothing beyond the moment of satisfaction. And this was the lesson I was dying for, the understanding that came too late. The knowledge that desire is the most dangerous trap, because it feels like connection when it is really just transaction. Just taking, just using. And the moment the taking stops being pleasurable or convenient, The person being taken from becomes disposable, becomes forgettable, becomes nothing. And they pulled the lever and the world went dark, and I died understanding that I had never mattered, that Marcus would forget me completely, that I would be erased from his memory as thoroughly as I was being erased from life. And this erasure was more complete than death, was being unmade not just physically but narratively, was having my entire existence reduced to footnote in his story, to the witch who tried to corrupt him, to the danger he escaped through righteousness. And I would not even be remembered accurately, would not even be granted the dignity of truth in my own death. But I did not stay dead, not completely. I woke in darkness that was not death but something else, woke choking and confused, woke to find I had been cut down after they declared me dead, woke to find myself in the care of women who practiced the old ways, who had seen the injustice and chosen to intervene. And they told me I could return to Salem and try to reclaim my life, or I could stay dead, could disappear, could become someone new. And I chose to stay dead because Verity Ashford was gone, was erased by Marcus's accusation and the village's acceptance. And trying to resurrect her would be futile, would be fighting against a narrative that had already been written and accepted. And besides, I had no desire to return to a place where I could be desired and destroyed in the span of 12 hours, where being wanted was indistinguishable from being marked for death, where intimacy was the mechanism of betrayal. And I learned from the women who saved me, learned the power I had been falsely accused of possessing, learned that magic was real and could be used not for corruption, but for survival, for building something beyond the reach of men like Marcus, beyond the reach of desire that destroyed rather than connected. I heard news of Marcus periodically over the years, heard that he had married Charity Green within months of my execution, heard that the marriage brought his family wealth and connections, heard that he had risen in colonial government exactly as planned, heard that he was respected and admired and considered a man of great moral character. And I felt nothing, felt that the anger I might have carried had burned out during my resurrection, had been replaced by something colder and more permanent. Not hate, but absolute indifference. The understanding that he was not worth the energy of emotion, that he had forgotten me so completely, that remembering him was giving him more significance than he deserved. And I focused instead on building a life that had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with Salem, nothing to do with being desired or wanted or valued by men who saw women as disposable. And I found satisfaction in this life, found purpose in helping other women who had been used and discarded, who had been desired and then destroyed, who understood that being wanted by the wrong person was more dangerous than being ignored. And we built something together, built a community beyond the reach of men's desire, beyond the reach of their capacity to forget us. Decades passed, and I heard eventually that Marcus was dead. Heard that he had died in his sleep, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Heard that he was mourned as a pillar of the community, that his funeral was attended by hundreds, that his legacy was assured, and I felt nothing. Felt that his death changed nothing because he had been dead to me since the morning he pointed at me in the village square. Since the moment he transformed his desire for me into my corruption of him. Since he had erased me from his memory while I still lived. And his actual death was simply confirmation of what had already been true, which was that he existed in a world separate from mine, that our paths had diverged completely, that we had nothing to do with each other. And I was glad that I felt nothing. Glad that he had not stolen my capacity for emotion along with everything else. Glad that my survival had not required me to carry him with me, to let him occupy space in my thoughts and heart, to give him the victory of haunting me. And I had survived not just his accusation, but his ability to matter to me. And perhaps that was the truest form of victory. Not revenge, but irrelevance. Not destroying him, but making him unimportant. Not hurting him, but simply ceasing to care whether he was hurt. And I am old now, older than he lived to be. And I practice what I was accused of, and I help women who need helping. And I tell them my story not as tragedy, but as lesson. Tell them that being desired is not being valued. That intimacy is not obligation. That man who can transform you from loved to accused in 12 hours will forget you in 12 minutes. And the only protection is refusing to be erasable. Refusing to let anyone's memory or lack thereof determine your worth. And I survived, and he is dust. And his legacy is children who never knew what he really was. And mine is women who live because I helped them escape men like him. And I choose to believe that matters more.